This is a very rich text full of symbols and allusions, but I wanted to start with, in some ways, the simple question of why does John take a story which clearly was circulating around, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have some version of it, this feeding of the 5,000. Like Mark, combines it with the walking on the water, and then instead of simply showing it as a sign of Jesus' compassion, moves into this lengthy discussion of what it is to be the bread of life and how he's the bread of life. It becomes, just to kind of do a segue, what John always says of his miracles, they're signs, that they always point beyond themselves. And here he says, here's what it points beyond. I'm going to give you a little sermon on bread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how that term sign does pop up here a couple of times at the beginning and the end of the story itself. And it's a heavily laden term in John. And exactly how signs are supposed to work is something that we need to think about. But the basic story that needs to be told, I think, about the feeding of the 5,000 is that from very early on it probably had some sort of Eucharistic symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the way in which the story is told in, even in Mark, probably the earliest version of this, it's not simply a story about sharing and about compassion and about learning to do all of that. It's also a story about Jesus as the primary exemplar and the cause of that compassion that we now share with one another.
And even the words breaking and blessing begins to sound like it's talking about Christian practice, not just Jesus' story.
It almost sounds as if it's taken from the rubrics of a first century worship book.
Yeah.
So that John might see in this story, a hint at Christian Eucharistic practice, is not surprising.
Okay.
I think others were probably doing so too. And that John would also see in the story of the walking on the water something terribly symbolic is not surprising, because we have that phrase in that story that we've already encountered earlier on in John, "It is I."
Yeah.
And here we have the picture of Jesus calming the waters of the sea, as God does in the Psalms, God who has control over the nature in a marvelous way, God who is that spirit that rushes over the deep in the opening of Genesis. It's God who controls things, and so having Jesus use those words that are the words of God's self-revelation in Exodus probably is not accidental.
Right.
And probably goes back to, prior to John, a way of understanding the significance of that story as a revelation of the divine power that's present with Jesus. So that John should see in these very popular early Christian stories something that deserves further reflection and elaboration, not at all surprising. And that's what we get then in Jesus' lengthy discourse on the bread of life.
So in some ways what he's doing is making more explicit what Mark's already doing implicitly, and Matthew doing more implicitly, with saying this is not just an aha moment of wonder working, but it has implications for Christian faith and how we live our lives.
Yeah, that's right. And if you think about all of those miracle stories in John, I think one of the things that he's a little bit nervous about is the way in which other Christians are using miracle stories as simple proofs of the deity of Jesus. And I think he has a suspicion about that move. And it might be based on some of the same concerns that moderns have. Can we verify that there's something that's beyond nature here? And even if there is, what does it really prove?
Yeah.
And so that's why I think he's very careful to choose the word sign rather than proof, because there's a pointer here, and the pointer depends not on the immediate intelligibility of the action, but on the lens of faith with which one sees it. And one of the themes that comes up in that Bread of Life discourse is the way in which people are drawn to Jesus by the Father. So it's not a matter of being forced into a relationship with Jesus and with God by some sort of external evidence. It's the relationship itself that establishes the possibility thereof. Something paradoxical there, but I think John
I teach
on
Presbyterians mostly, and they're always looking for Calvin under every verse. And they keep hoping that this drawing will be some kind of, it's destined from the beginning.
Right.
But I think it's much more complicated than that. I
think so.
think the drawing leaves a kind of interesting balance between what the believer does and what God does.
Right. We bumped up against this a little bit ago when we were seeing the business about judgment and when judgment takes place.
Yeah.
And is judgment sort of a predetermined thing, or does it come from the action of the person being judged?
Yeah, exactly.
And John, in a very non-Presbyterian, non-Lutheran way, seems to affirm, what's the action that finally determines what the judgment is? There are other strands of the theological tradition that have wrestled with this and looked at passages like the Father is drawing, and medieval Catholic theology, for instance, would talk about prevenient grace.
Yes.
And that's picked up in some of the Protestant dogmatic traditions too. So something like that is going on. There's a dialectic between God and humankind that is imaged by the miracles of Jesus, and his status vis-a-vis God is not proven by those miracles. I think that's one of the things that John wants to say. So what is it then that John sees in these miraculous signs, the multiplication of the bread and the loaves, that pushes to a deeper meaning? How do you...
Well, partly I think he's doing what we've seen before. He's taking stories that they will know, in this case the story of the manna in the wilderness, and saying, all right, here's a nice example of what God has done in the past. Now the same God continues to act, only more so. Then in time of need, God gave you bread that will not perish, that perishes. Now I'm giving you bread that lasts for eternity. Then God gave you bread that was little pieces of manna. Now God gives you bread that is c'est moi once again. I am the bread of life. I'm the one for whom you've been looking. And it plays very nicely with the woman. What's the water you really need? It's living water. What's the bread you really need? It's bread from heaven. Who is the living water? I, Jesus, am the living water. Who is the bread that lasts to eternal life? That's me too, as a matter of fact.
Absolutely right. I want to get back to the final point there and how it is that Jesus, the c'est moi, functions as the bread of life. But there is one little technical thing that I think is worth noting. We talked in some of our earlier conversations about midrash as a technique of John. That is the exploration of Scripture. And all of this bread of life discourse can actually be analyzed very nicely as a traditional Jewish midrash on the text of a psalm, Psalm 74. Bread from heaven he gave them to eat, referring to the manna. And what Jesus does is to comment on that psalm and take each individual element of it and find some way of referring it to something in his own experience, himself, finally. It's not manna in the past.
It's this
bread now, which is me. It's not he gave, he gives in the here and now.
It's not Moses who gave, it's God who gives.
It's God. And it's not to eat in a physical sense, it's to what? That's where the bottom line comes.
That is where the bottom line comes in.
And there are, I don't know how you unpack that eating at the metaphorical level in John. I see it working in two ways. One, there's another scriptural text that's brought in. You are taught of God, and those who are taught of God are those who eat. So again, it's the conceptual or the intellectual.
And it's like the wisdom business.
That's right.
Dining at wisdom's table.
That's right. So it's coming out of the same tradition that we saw working in the episode of The Woman at the Well, where water serves as the symbol for this intellectual, spiritual thing. But John, it seems to me, pushes it a little further in this case. So it's not simply understanding some sort of propositional truth or gaining access to some esoteric revelation. It comes to the point at which we concluded the reading. It is my flesh that I give for the life of the world. And at one level, that seems to bring us back to the literal and the physical. And the verses that follow at the end of that discourse seem to point in that direction, push in that direction. You have to chomp on.
If you don't gnaw me, you won't have eternal life.
The word that's used there is a very concrete word. The word that, as you say, it would be used for a cow chewing its cud, or someone munching a hoagie.
Exactly, right.
So that's the kind of eating that you have to do, and that seems to point in a kind of sacramental direction. Where consuming the Eucharistic elements is a sine qua non, and that's indeed the way it used to be read by lots of...
Well, and that's the point where the hyper-Protestant Bultmann of 4.2 referred to says the ecclesiastical redactor comes in and changes it to make it more Eucharistic. And code for ecclesiastical redactor, as you well know, I say this hesitantly, is early Catholic. And his idea is some Catholic got in there and took his Lutheran text and got all the sacraments in there. But I'm with you. I think it's of a piece, certainly by the time the gospel writer gets a hold of it.
And I think the way to connect it and to see what's going on in John's theological assessment of the tradition is to see where it is that we encounter the flesh and what it is we do when we encounter the flesh of Jesus. And this could be a reflection on the ritual action of enacting the Lord's Supper. because after all, what do you remember there? You remember the death of Jesus until he comes.
Right.
And so the flesh that you're encountering in this sapiential discourse is the flesh that hangs on the cross,
Yeah.
for which
Yes,
the glory of God is
not
revealed.
two different things.
Right.
Yeah.
The two are intimately
Yeah.
related, both in the ecclesiastical tradition, but I think already in John.
Yeah.
And John never wants to give up that concrete in order to get to the general. And so he starts in this whole chapter 6 from the very concrete story of Jesus giving disciples, hungry disciples, bread and fish, meeting their physical needs, showing somehow his divine power by walking on water, identifying himself as God.
Ego and me.
Ego eimi.
Yeah.
And then going on and talking about the significance of that and ultimately referring it to his death on the cross,
Yeah.
which now is available to those who would be his disciples through the eyes of faith, through the inspiration of God. God has to be at work in this in order to make it all work. But ultimately it hinges on seeing and believing what happens at the moment of glorification on the cross. That's what the flesh
Which is yet to come.
Yeah.
But it will be flesh.
Mm-hmm.
It's also striking, we didn't read this passage, but it's striking that at the end of the story, this is where people begin to turn away. Mm-hmm. That the story becomes concrete in this kind of shocking way of flesh on a cross, manifested now in this meal, is more than some can take, and they begin to turn away from Jesus.
Right, and we spoke in the past about the ways in which early Christian experience is somehow mapped onto the story of Jesus.
Exactly.
And a lot of it has to do with the relationship between believers in Jesus and non-believers, mainly Jewish relatives probably.
Probably, cousins.
Early Christians.
Yeah.
Here, the mapping seems to point to what's going on within the community. And there may be
the walkers away.
That's right.
Yeah.
These are people who have been part of the Jesus tradition, and all of a sudden there's something they can't swallow. To
literally.
move the metaphor along.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I do think that it's always striking to me, because I've been a pastor as well as a teacher, that our mythological idea that Jesus got these wholehearted believers around him who then just stuck with it till the day they died, understates the gospel stories and certainly misstates the early history of the church. That from the beginning, this belief stuff is tough stuff, both to believe it and to act it out, and that from the beginning, people will find that too hard to take and wander away. And this gospel, I think, partly is encouraging folk to take it on with all its risks, like Nicodemus, be born again, like the woman at the well, spread the word. This is not easy stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John pushes it in your face.
Pushes it in your face time after time after time. I think that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Well, a rich story.
A rich story, a good break.
Yep.